My name is Nora Vance. I am 32 years old. It is 3:14 on an Easter Sunday afternoon, and the tablecloth my mother pressed before we arrived still has a crease running down the center, a thin white ridge she missed with the iron, running from the silver candlestick all the way to the edge where my father has set his water glass. The room smells like glazed ham and lemon oil, the kind of lemon oil that means someone cleaned the furniture so it would look important before company arrived. My Aunt Ruth is sitting directly across from me with her reading glasses pushed up to the crown of her head and her hand resting beside her wine glass in a way that is meant to appear casual. It is not casual. Nothing in this room is casual right now, and everyone seated at this table knows it, even the ones who are pretending not to. The man my mother introduced as someone she had engaged professionally is standing at the far end of the dining room in a gray blazer with a pocket square he has touched 3 times in the last 12 minutes. His name is Ray Hofstetter, and he is a private investigator, and he is holding 2 manila folders. His hands are otherwise completely still. The kind of still that belongs to someone who has spent years delivering findings to rooms full of people who did not fully understand what they were asking for and has learned through repetition to keep what comes next entirely off of his face. I know what is in those folders. I have known more or less for 6 weeks. But I need to tell you how we got here because this did not begin at an Easter table, and it did not begin with a private investigator, and it certainly did not begin this year. It began with a single sentence in a very specific register, the warm, slightly sighing tone my mother uses when she wants to establish the correct order of things without anyone being able to accuse her of cruelty. I was 21 years old the first time I overheard my mother describe my career to someone who was not me. I had been waitressing at Meridian, a mid-priced American bistro 3 blocks from Portland State, for 7 months. I needed the income. I was halfway through a part-time certification program in logistics management that I was paying for 1 shift at a time, and the restaurant schedule was built around evening hours that left my mornings free. The tips were consistent. My rent was low. I was saving every dollar I did not spend on tuition. My mother walked in on a Thursday evening in late October with 4 women from her book club. I was at the hostess station. I watched her scan the room the way you scan a room when you half expect to see someone familiar and are already deciding how you want to feel about it. When her eyes found mine, something in her face shifted. Not cruelty. Something more practiced than cruelty. The adjustment of a person who has encountered something inconvenient and is already deciding where to put it. She said nothing to me directly. I seated the table. I said hello. She asked how the evening was going in the polite, surface-level tone of a customer who works in the same neighborhood as the restaurant and happened to come in. I nodded once. Then I went back to the station. What I heard 15 minutes later, from Rosa, a server who had been passing their table with a water pitcher and had the careful look of someone who was not sure whether she was helping, was this. My mother, responding to a question about her daughters, said warmly, with a small resigned laugh, Amber is in real estate now, which has been wonderful for her. And Nora, well, she waits tables right now. She has ideas about some kind of career in, I think, shipping? But she's always been a little scattered. We just hope she figures out what she really wants. Rosa delivered this with the precision of someone who had repeated it exactly right because she understood it mattered. I thanked her. I kept my face still. I reached for the order pad instead. Before I tell you what the next 11 years look like, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I want to know how far this story travels before it's over. My mother's approach was never cruelty in the way most people would recognize. She never raised her voice. She never said anything she could not, if pressed, reframe as concern. She was, by most measures, a warm woman who had worked steadily to raise 2 daughters and wanted good things for both of them. The mechanism was comparison, and she wielded it with the consistency of someone who had stopped noticing they were doing it. My sister Amber, 2 years older, licensed real estate agent since 25, was the fixed reference point. Amber had professional headshots and a website. She wore blazers to holiday dinners and spoke with assurance about commission structures and square footage, and my mother's face when Amber talked about her work was the face of someone watching a prediction about the world come true in real time. When my name came up, the face was different. Not unkind. Careful. Nora is finding her path, she would say. Or, asterisk, she's always been our free spirit. Asterisk, or, the phrase I heard most consistently, deployed at Christmas gatherings and birthday dinners with the timing of a woman who had learned exactly where it landed. Asterisk, we just want her to be happy. Whatever that ends up looking like. Asterisk. That phrase, in her particular delivery, communicated one thing to every person within earshot, that I was adrift, that my ambitions were soft and undefined, that I was the daughter you loved and hoped for the best with, the way you hope for the best with unpredictable weather. At my father's family's Christmas dinner, 3 years into my company, my mother used the phrase in front of 12 people. My cousin Colleen had mentioned in passing that she'd seen something about a logistics company with my name in a trade publication. My mother said, gently, asterisk, she does have this little venture she's been working on. It's early days. We just want her to be happy, whatever it turns out to be. Asterisk. I said nothing. I let her finish. I reached for the cranberry sauce instead. There were 14 incidents like this across 7 years that I can recall, with specific detail. I know this because I am the kind of person who counts things precisely. I kept a note in my phone, not out of anger, but out of the same professional reflex that made me track every other variable that would eventually matter. Date, setting, exact phrasing, audience size. 14 times. In 7 years. The second incident was at Thanksgiving, the year I turned 23, when my father's brother asked what I was up to and my mother answered before I could. Asterisk, she's working in the service industry while she thinks things over. Asterisk, I had just renewed the lease on my first proper office space. The fifth was at my parents' anniversary dinner, when a couple they'd known for 30 years asked after me. My mother said, asterisk, she's figuring herself out. You know how some kids take longer. Asterisk, I had, by that point, 11 clients and a waiting list. The most specific was at my cousin's bridal shower, held in a rented event space in Lake Oswego, where a woman I had never met asked what I did for work. My mother was across the room and should not have been able to hear the question. She heard it. She's in between things, my mother said, projecting over 2 tables of salad forks and ribbon-wrapped gifts. Asterisk, she's done some service work, some odd jobs. We're just rooting for her. Asterisk. That was the same month our Series A closed at $22 million. I set down my champagne. I kept my face still. I went back to talking to the woman beside me about where she'd registered for dishes. Vance Meridian Logistics did not begin as a company. It began as a spreadsheet on a table in my apartment on Northeast Alberta, built from 2 trade periodicals, a Federal Port Authority database, and 3 years of watching a specific problem go unsolved. The problem was this. Mid-sized Pacific Northwest distributors were losing between 8 and 22% of their projected quarterly margin to freight mismanagement, not because the freight industry was incompetent, but because the services they needed existed only at scales they couldn't access. The large freight brokers served volume clients. Small operators couldn't handle the complexity. There was a gap in the middle and it was expensive and nobody was building into it. I wrote a 60-page analysis. I identified 9 potential clients within driving distance. Then I spent 6 weeks rewriting the rate sheet because the numbers had to be low enough to get the first signature and high enough to survive the first year of operation without capital I did not have. I ran the model every night for 6 weeks. I approached the first client on a Tuesday morning in the spring of my 24th year with a printed proposal and a business card I had ordered online for $19. They asked 2 hours worth of questions. I answered every one. They signed that Friday. The contract was worth $63,500. I deposited the retainer check and registered the LLC the following Thursday. By the time I was 27, Vance Meridian had 11 employees and 40 clients across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. I had moved out of the apartment on Alberta into a proper office in the Pearl District. Nothing large, nothing showy, but a space with a conference room and a reception desk and a lease in my company's name. By 29, I had brought on Priya Mehta as COO. Priya had spent 6 years as a senior director at a national freight company and had written in her resignation letter, in language I kept a copy of, that she was leaving to work on what she called the most systematically underserved logistics segment in the country. She took a pay cut to come. She has never once mentioned it. By the time I was 31, Vance Meridian had processed over $400 million in total freight volume and held active contracts with 3 of the top 15 Pacific Northwest maritime distributors. Our Series B documentation, finalized that spring, put the company's valuation at $140 million. In 2022, Incorporated magazine included me in their 30 Under 30 list, logistics and supply chain category. My photo ran alongside a 40-word bio that described the company's growth trajectory and my methodology. My mother told her book club, I waited tables. I want to be precise about that because the exact nature of the imprecision matters. She was not uninformed. She knew, in the way you know things you have decided not to revise, that I had started some kind of business. The word logistics had come up in our conversations. She had been told, in clear, direct language, on at least 3 separate occasions, that the company was real, operational, and growing. Once by me, at a Christmas dinner 3 years in, when I walked her through what we did, and who our clients were, and what our revenue looked like. Once by my father, who had read the Inc. profile and emailed it to her with a one-line note I saw over his shoulder. Asterisk, seems like Nora's doing well. Asterisk, once by my cousin Colleen, who had seen the trade publication mention and brought it up at Thanksgiving in front of 6 people. My mother had responded, each time, with some variation of, asterisk, that's wonderful, that she has something she's so focused on. Asterisk, I know, with a reasonable degree of certainty, that she had never searched my name or the company's name in the year since it was founded. I know this because I had access through a colleague who managed our digital presence to a summary of search traffic that referenced company principals. From our family home's zip code, in a 2-year window, I was able to review 0 searches. She had decided, at some point between my waitressing job and my first client, that my ambitions were the kind that did not require investigation. Because investigation would mean revision. And revision would mean correcting a version of me she had already distributed to 30 people over a decade. That was fine. I had a company to run. What changed everything was a man named Howard Greenwald. In February of this year, Vance Meridian finalized a preliminary partnership agreement with Cascade Rail and Freight, a Mid-Pacific logistics consortium with significant institutional presence across the Pacific Northwest business community. The signing took place in a conference room on the 34th floor of a Seattle tower. Bad lighting, very good coffee, 8 people around the table. One of those 8 was Howard Greenwald, who sat on the Cascade Rail Advisory Board. Howard Greenwald's wife had been in my mother's book club for 12 years. I did not know this until 6 days after the signing, when my mother called on a Sunday morning in the register she uses when she has received information she doesn't know where to put. Someone at book club mentioned something, she said, about you being at some kind of business event in Seattle. Yes, I said. That's right. A signing of some kind. I told her, briefly, a partnership agreement. Maritime logistics. Cascade Rail. The value of the arrangement was significant. It had gone well. Silence. Then, that sounds very complicated. It is a little, I said. Amber is closing on a 4-bedroom in Lake Oswego this week. Did I mention that? I said she hadn't mentioned it. We spoke for another 4 minutes, mostly about Amber's commission structure and Greg's podcast. She said she'd talk to me soon. I said I looked forward to it. I set the phone down. I kept my face still. I understood what was coming. The call from my father arrived on a Thursday evening in March. My father, Dennis, is not a cruel man. He is a man who has spent 35 years choosing the path of least friction in his marriage, which means he has become, by default, a kind of early warning system in my direction. He tells me things before they happen in the vague hope that forewarning reduces damage. It has never, in my experience, reduced anything. But I've come to understand it as the form of care he is equipped to give. He said, with the careful directness of a man delivering news he personally opposed, "Your mother has hired someone to investigate your company." I let a moment pass. Why? She doesn't believe the numbers. What Howard Greenwald said to his wife. She thinks something was misunderstood or exaggerated, and she wants clarity before he paused. She's having him present the findings at Easter. She's bringing a private investigator to Easter dinner to present findings to the family. I turned the pen on my desk over in my hand. Once.
Dad, I said.
Does she understand that if she pays a licensed investigator to examine Vance Meridian, he's going to find a $140 million company with 63 employees and a series beyond public record? My father was quiet for 4 full seconds. I don't think, he said at last, that she has thought it quite that far through. Okay, I said. He said, Are you angry? I sat with that honestly for a moment. No, I said. I'm not angry. I called Priya as soon as we hung up. Priya took the 4 seconds she always takes when she's choosing between several possible responses. Then, what do you want to do?
Nothing, I said.
Nothing. Nothing, I said. He's going to find the company. The Series B. The Cascade Rail press release. The incorporated listing. The Freight Council certification. It's all public record. He's also going to find the public statements, she said quietly. I said, I know. She understood what that meant. A professional investigator, running background on a business subject who has been publicly mischaracterized by a related party, will, as a matter of standard due diligence, note the discrepancy. Note it and document it, and include it in findings. That is what professional due diligence requires. You want to be in the room, she said. I'll be there for Easter. She was quiet a beat longer than usual. Then, Nora, are you sure about this? There are things you don't need to arrange, I said, when the truth is already larger than the story someone told about you. You just need to be present when the two things are in the same room. She said, Okay. I said, Okay. Over the next 6 weeks, I ran my company. I attended the quarterly operations review. I finalized a new contract with a Sacramento distributor, $178,000 annual retainer. I hired 2 freight analysts and traveled to Annapolis for an industry conference where I sat on a panel about supply chain resilience in Pacific Corridor ports. I answered my mother's text about Easter with 4 words. Asterisk, I'll be there. Yes. Asterisk, I sent Amber a birthday card with a gift card inside. I made no other preparations. No speech. No folder of my own. No coordinated response. There was nothing to prepare. The truth had been sitting in public databases for years, in the Inc. archive, in the Oregon Business Registry, in the Cascade Rail press release, in the Pacific Northwest Freight Council's certified provider list. It had been sitting there the entire time, available to anyone who looked. Nobody in my family had looked. A private investigator whose livelihood depended on finding what was actually true would look. That was all that needed to happen. Easter Sunday arrived with low cloud cover and the wet earth smell the Willamette Valley carries in early April. Damp soil, cut grass, chimney smoke from a neighbor still burning the last of the season's wood. My mother had cleaned the house carefully. The tablecloth was pressed. The furniture gleamed with lemon oil. The ham had been glazed with orange peel and brown sugar, and the dining room table was set for 9, with the good china and the wine glasses she reserved for occasions that required them. My Aunt Ruth and her husband Leonard arrived first. My cousin Colleen had driven down from Tacoma. Amber came with Greg, who mentioned his podcast within 8 minutes of walking through the door. My father stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he already knew. Ray Hofstetter arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon, in the gray blazer, carrying a leather briefcase that was worn soft at the corners. My mother introduced him to the table with the brightness of a woman who had decided she was being entirely reasonable. She said, "This is someone I've engaged professionally to help us all get a clear picture of a few things." Ruth nodded. Leonard looked at his plate. Amber put her phone face down on the table. I sat down. I folded my hands. I took a sip of water. My Aunt Ruth said helpfully, "I think this is a very good idea, Sandra. Honestly, we've had questions." My mother smoothed the front of her blouse. "We just want a complete picture." Hofstetter set his briefcase on the sideboard. He removed the 2 folders. He placed them in front of himself and clasped his hands over them and looked at the room. He said, "Before I present my findings, I want to note for the record that I was retained to investigate one subject. In the course of that investigation, standard professional due diligence required that I run background on 2 additional parties whose public statements were materially relevant to the factual basis of my brief. My findings address all 3 subjects." My mother blinked. "That's fine. Let's begin with Nora." He opened the first folder. He placed it in the center of the table, turned outward so the room could read it. On the top sheet was the Inc. 30 under 30 citation from 2022, pulled from the magazine's digital archive, printed cleanly, my name at the top in the same font the magazine used. Below it was the Series B documentation summary: valuation figure, lead investor, filing date, state of incorporation, all clearly legible. Below that was the Cascade Rail Partnership press release, timestamped February of this year, my name and title in the second paragraph. Hofstadter read from his notes, without consulting the folder. Nora Vance, founder and chief executive officer of Vance Meridian Logistics, incorporated in the state of Oregon in 2017. Current company valuation as per Series B financing documentation, $140 million. Certified Category A logistics provider, Pacific Northwest Freight Council. Named to Incorporated Magazine's 30 under 30, 2022, Logistics and Supply Chain category. Active partnership agreement with Cascade Rail and Freight executed February of this year. The company employs 63 full-time staff across Oregon, Washington, and California, and holds primary contracts with 3 of the top 15 Pacific Northwest maritime distributors. All documentation is complete, independently verifiable, and drawn from public record. He stopped reading. The room held the silence in the way a room does when a piece of information arrives that is too large to process and too specific to dismiss, when the numbers are too exact and the citations are too named, and there is simply nowhere for doubt to go. My Aunt Ruth's hand moved slowly to cover her mouth. Amber looked up from the table. Whatever expression crossed her face in that moment, I did not have a word for it. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. She looked at my mother. Leonard picked up his water glass, held it, and set it back down without drinking. My cousin Colleen, who had driven 4 hours from Tacoma, was very still in the way of someone who understood. She was witnessing something she would be asked about for years. My father pressed both palms flat against the tablecloth and kept his eyes on the centerpiece, a bowl of white tulips my mother had arranged that morning. My mother was still holding her wine glass. She had been holding it since the moment Hofstadter opened the folder. I watched her fingers adjust on the stem, a small, involuntary tightening, the physical response that precedes understanding rather than following it. I said nothing. I kept my face still. I reached for my water. Ray Hofstadter picked up the second folder. He said, "In conducting this investigation, I identified a pattern of public characterization of the subject by a related party that was materially inconsistent with the documented record. Specifically, I identified multiple statements attributed to Sandra Vance, made to third parties across a range of social settings over a period of approximately 4 years, in which the subject's professional occupation and standing were described in terms that did not reflect documented fact." He placed the second folder in front of my mother. She set down her wine glass. The sound it made touching the tablecloth was the only sound in the room. "This folder contains documentation of 7 incidents," Hofstadter said, "in which Sandra Vance described her daughter's occupation to third parties as either waitressing, serving tables, or doing something in food service. We're not entirely sure. These incidents are drawn from 3 sources: book club correspondence, obtained with the written consent of a participating member, 2 community event records, and signed statements from 2 third-party witnesses. The incidents span from approximately 4 years ago to 11 days ago."
He paused.
11 days ago, he said again, was after Mrs. Howard Greenwald had reported the Cascade Rail signing at a book club meeting. The characterization was made in possession of that information. Ruth lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at my mother with an expression I had spent 32 years on this earth without ever seeing on Ruth's face, a slow, quiet, recalibrating look, as though something she had always taken as a fixture of the room had just revealed itself to be something else entirely. My mother said, I didn't know how to. She stopped. She looked at the folder.
She did not open it.
Amber said, very quietly, without looking up. Mom. My father reached for the bread basket. I did not answer. I did not expand. I let the room hold what it had. Before Hofstadter left, he set a sealed envelope at Amber's place setting. He said, in a low, professional voice, that it concerned a pending licensing matter related to a recent property transaction, and that addressing it before the end of the quarter was advisable. Amber picked up the envelope. She turned it over once in her hands. She did not open it at the table. She and Greg left not long after the dishes were cleared. The rest of Easter dinner was the quietest meal I have ever eaten at my mother's table. The ham was genuinely the best she has ever made it. The conversation that happened was about the weather and about Leonard's retirement plans and about Colleen's drive down from Tacoma. Nobody mentioned the folders. Nobody mentioned Hofstadter. Nobody mentioned anything that had happened in the dining room between 2:47 and 3:14. My mother followed me out to the driveway as I was getting my coat. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her arms crossed, not against the cold. The evening was mild, but in the way of someone who is physically organizing what they need to say. She said, I didn't know it had grown to that size. I said, I know. She said, I should have asked more. I should have paid more attention to what you were actually building. I said, yes. She looked at the driveway. She looked at the rose bushes beside the porch steps that had just begun to bud. Then she said, I'm proud of you, Nora. I want you to know that. I am genuinely proud of you. I said, thank you. I meant it. Not because it resolved anything. 11 years is not resolved by an Easter driveway, but because she said it and I believed her, and that mattered in its own small way. I drove home in the rain. I called Priya 23 minutes into the drive, at the point on the Burnside Bridge where the city opens up on both sides and the river is dark and very wide below. She answered on the second ring. Tell me everything. I did. Chronologically, factually, the way I deliver reports, the folders in order, my mother's face when Hofstadter placed the second one, Ruth's hand dropping from her mouth, Amber's expression when she looked up, the sealed envelope, the driveway. When I finished, Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How are you?
Tired, I said. And also okay.
Both at the same time, which I didn't expect. That's the right way to feel. Is it? Yes, she said. That's exactly the right way to feel about something that took 11 years to finish. We were quiet together for a few seconds. The rain was steady on the windshield. Then she said, You know what I think? People who build their understanding of you on a picture that stopped being accurate, they don't update it because updating it would cost them something. Your family assumed your silence meant agreement. It didn't. It meant patience. I watched the streetlights on Burnside slide past. Yeah, I said. You want to grab dinner Wednesday? We have the Sacramento numbers to review.
Wednesday's good, I said.
I drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that I didn't have a word for at the time, and that I now understand was simply the specific peace that arrives when you no longer have to hold two things at once, the truth of what you built, and the story someone else decided to tell about it. I want to say something to you before I close, because I think some of you know exactly what it feels like to be in that restaurant, or at that Christmas dinner, or at that table, while someone you love gives the world a version of you that stopped being accurate a long time ago. Setting a limit is not an attack. It is information. When you go quiet, when you build in the hours they've decided you're doing nothing, when you say okay and reach for your coffee and let the wrong picture of you live in rooms you're not in, you are not being weak. You are choosing which argument you want to win. I chose the argument that could be documented. And then I waited and I built until the documentation was impossible to argue with. You can love people who have dismissed you and still refuse to collapse back into the version of yourself they needed you to be. That is not coldness. It is not bitterness. It is the most honest thing you can do for both of you. Love is not a blank check. It never was for any of us. The people who chose to see you, who showed up at the starting line when the spreadsheet was still a spreadsheet and the idea was still a theory, those people are more your family than the ones who share your blood and forget to look. Biology is a fact. Belonging is a choice. Priya Mehta knew what I was building before a single folder existed, before the first client signed, before there was anything to verify. That is the thing I carry. Leaving the shape of yourself that fits inside someone else's story is not abandonment. It is not ingratitude. It is the only rational response to a room that was never built to hold you at your actual size. You cannot grow in a space designed around who someone needed you to remain. And you do not owe anyone the performance of smallness just because they were more comfortable when you were small. And the quiet, the specific quiet of a morning where no one is ranking you, or updating their book club, or explaining you to a room of people you've never met, that quiet is not emptiness. That is what it was supposed to feel like. All along. From the very beginning. My mother said, I waited tables. She was right, technically, for about 14 months 9 years ago. What she never imagined was that I was keeping every receipt. Tell me honestly, if you had been sitting at that table when she said it, would you have smiled and said nothing, or would you have spoken up right then? The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation. Asterisk.